You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 22nd of October 2024 on Monocle Radio.
It's 2 a.m. in Pyongyang, 2000 in Kazan, 1800 here in London and 1400 in Brasilia. That's the time on Monocle Radio, brought to you by Chanel Watches. Is North Korea really about to invade Europe? Why are so many world leaders willing to RSVP in the affirmative to Vladimir Putin? And would British people wear those Christmas jumpers if they were sober? I'm Andrew Mueller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Mueller. My guests Andrew Thompson and Julia Lasica will discuss today's big stories, and we'll hear from the author Darshana Mbarua about her new book, arguing that foreign policy thinkers focusing on the Pacific might be looking at the wrong ocean. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Mueller, and I am joined today by Andrew Thompson, Latin American specialist and regular Latin news contributor, and by Monocle writer and researcher Julia Lasica. Hello to you both.
Hello.
Julia, as the only person at this table not called Andrew, you can go first. You have recently returned from your honeymoon. Many congratulations, obviously, but you noticed things about the world while on it.
Yes. Well, thank you, first of all. And secondly, yes, I was in Singapore and Indonesia. And while we were in Indonesia, we went to Sumatra. And there we just saw so many palm oil plantations, and we saw these incredible new roads that had just basically been carved through the landscape and through what used to be jungle. And we learned about, tigers have sort of been erased from sections of Sumatra, and elephants and special, whatever types of monkeys. And it's all Chinese investment. It's all this Chinese money pouring into these areas of Indonesia. It's fascinating.
To be clear, this wasn't a Chinese infrastructure-themed honeymoon.
No, but we just found ourselves driving across a lot of Chinese infrastructure.
Andrew, you have, I don't know whether by way of setting up a seamless link, there was any Chinese investment involved in your recent outing to the theatre, but you have nonetheless undertaken a recent outing to the theatre.
I've been to see a theatrical production called Redlands, which for people of a certain age, i.e. myself, who were very interested in the Rolling Stones in the 1970s, it's a great trip down memory lane with some of the songs, but essentially...
It's not a musical, is it?
No, it doesn't qualify as a musical. Yes, I know, but it's more to do with sex, drugs and rock and roll. And in particular, in the 1960s, Keith Richards and Mick Jagger were prosecuted for drugs consumption.
They were?
At a house which is about a mile away from where I live, called Redlands.
This prompted the famous editorial in the Times, did it not, about
exactly,
breaking a butterfly on a wheel?
Yes. So the theatrical production is, of course, it mixes true fact with fiction and creates various subplots and stories to do with Marianne Faithfull, to do with Michael Havers, who is the defence solicitor, defence QC, I should say, in the court case. And it's a good, enjoyable, stimulating the mind, and they get to prance around like exaggerated versions of Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, which they do very well.
So they could put 4 stars next to your name on the poster if they felt like it.
Yes.
Okay.
In a word.
Fair enough. Well, we will start properly with the prospect that either Russia and Ukraine have opened up a new front between North and South Korea, or North and South Korea have opened up a new front between Russia and Ukraine, or both. In Seoul, South Korea has summoned Russia's ambassador for a meeting at which biscuits seem not to have been offered, insisting that a contingent of North Korean soldiers believed to be in Russia en route Ukraine be sent back home forthwith. Russia, interestingly, has not responded with its reflexive, indignant denials, merely played it down as normal military cooperation between allies. Julia, you were in Ukraine as recently as this summer. You didn't bump into any North Koreans while you were there?
Luckily not. I was Yes, luckily very far away from the front line. No North Koreans.
But do we buy the implied line here from Russia that this is none of anybody's business? It's not necessarily any more or less sinister than, for example, American soldiers being sent to Poland?
No, I don't buy it. No, because first of all, we know that these troops will be sent, and probably quite a few of them now are within occupied territories of Ukraine. And there have been intelligence reports that for several months now, there have been, North Korean intelligence officers and officers training troops within occupied Ukraine, and they are being used on the front line. And this is a huge escalation. This is another country's troops being actively used to fight Ukraine on Ukraine's own land. And the fact that this is quite bold from both Russia and North Korea. They perhaps feel that they won't suffer any consequences as a result of this decision.
I mean, Andrew, is it likely to our probably not terribly trained eyes that they will be much use anyway? I mean, the North Korean soldiers most likely can't speak Russian. The North Korean military, give or take some involvement in Vietnam, Yom Kippur and the Uganda Bush War, hasn't fought a proper war since 1953. And I would have assumed that there is a danger that if you let several thousand North Koreans within defecting distance of Europe, you're not going to get all of them back.
Yes, I mean, I think it's actually precisely for the reason you're mentioning. It's quite hard to understand how effective a fighting force the North Koreans might be 70 years on after the Korean War. I think the other dimension which is very important to keep an eye on is munitions and arms supply. I noticed that the head of Ukrainian military intelligence has said that North Korean-made missiles are very effective. And he said that it was a real problem for Ukraine, and that, as he put it, you could track shipments of munitions being made to Russia, and then after a few weeks, an acceleration or an intensification of the attacks on Ukraine.
I mean, Julie, is there, though, in this anything encouraging for Ukrainians? I know it has been an extremely long and difficult 2.5 years by this point for Ukraine, but if Russia 2.5 years into what was supposed to be a 72-hour operation is having to press gang legions of North Korean conscripts, it does rather suggest that this is deviated from the plan somewhat.
Yeah, I guess there is that element of optimism. I mean, Russia has just lost entire, chunks of its population, male population on this war. And obviously that means, things aren't going super well for them. But I think it's also quite worrying because, as I said, it's an impunity. It's a feeling that you won't be punished for this sort of move, very dangerous move. And I think one thing is also that these North Korean troops will be getting battlefield experience, which is really dangerous for South Korea and for the rest of the world because they're going to be exposed to really brutal conditions. They'll learn things that they'll bring then back to their country, assuming they don't, die on the battlefield. And they'll be using that to just improve their military operations.
There is some suggestion that as a consequence of this, Andrew, and that goes back to where we came in, i.e. Russia's ambassador to Seoul being summoned, as they say in the diplomatic, it is now reported that South Korea will consider tooling up Ukraine directly. And South Korea has they've kind of done it at one remove, but they have very close to Ukraine recently supplied a huge order of K2 Black Panther tanks and FA-50 fighter jets to Poland. South Korea would be within its rights at this point, wouldn't it, to decide that, well, this is now our conflict as well?
I think you can probably make that case. As I understand it, South Korea has been providing purely humanitarian aid to Ukraine up to this point. But in the light of what the North Koreans are doing, I think any reasonably balanced observer would say that taking it a step further and beginning to supply munitions or other types of help would be entirely justified in international law.
The pessimistic analysis, I guess, Julia, is that you could now see that it maybe doubles what has always been the conundrum in dealing with Russia, in that you are dealing with a nuclear-armed power whose red lines are shiftable and blurry, and whose reaction to any given circumstance you can't necessarily bank on. And now we have two of them.
Yeah. I mean, it's not a great situation that we find ourselves in. But, as you were just saying, Andrew, it's so important that states step up their support for Ukraine, because this is a conflict that is ever evolving and it has the potential to, expand. It is expanding. There are now two countries fighting Ukraine at the same time. And
this is, of course, on top of well-sourced reports that various other nationalities have been in Russian uniform in Ukraine.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, Iran itself is supplying ballistic missiles to Ukraine. In fact, there's a really horrible figure that North Korea supplies half of all the shells that Russia uses in Ukraine against Ukrainians. So it's the support that Russia is receiving and the kind of exchange of information between North Korea and Russia it can't be sort of overstated how important is we deal with that situation.
Well, let's move along to Kazan and to a demonstration that, rather depressingly given everything we have just been discussing, Russian President Vladimir Putin has not entirely run out of friends. He is now hosting the annual summit of Brics, the pan-national grouping which originally included Brazil, Russia, India and China as BRIC, expanded its name to embrace South Africa and become BRICS, and now includes Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran and the United Arab Emirates, with Turkey believed waiting in the wings, all of which, and I did work on this for some time, conjures the acronym CUTESIA, which is almost intriguingly counterintuitive. But in total, the leaders of fully 36 countries have shown up at this thing. Andrew, first of all, also apparently going, as of this broadcast, Antonio Guterres, UN Secretary-General. Should he?
I think my answer would be yes. Because you need to maintain some lines of communication open.
He's got a telephone.
Yes, but it's kind of symbolic, isn't it? And he's been quite outspoken in attacking aggression or criticizing Russia's aggression in Ukraine. So from his point of view, he doesn't want to perhaps cut off communications entirely, with the possibility of some future negotiation, which nobody can as yet agree on. But I see it as a kind of leaving a door open exercise.
Julia, it's fair to say Ukraine has been unimpressed, first with the prospect of Guterres' visit, but by the spectacle as a whole, I guess. And I can see that it must be incredibly dispiriting, because Ukraine's strategy for 2.5 years has been to try to isolate Vladimir Putin, turn him into a pariah, and now he is hosting 36 national leaders.
Yes, but we also can't overstate the different positions that Ukraine and Russia are in. Russia is a country that has, for decades, even centuries, cultivated cultural links, military links, economic links with countries all over the world.
True.
And in the last few decades, they've been really working on African nations, and you've got the presence of Wagner mercenaries in that continent as well as in the Middle East. Whereas Ukraine is a country that has been, under imperial rule and hasn't been able to decide its own foreign policy. And really, since 2022, has finally started to sort of open itself up to the world. Ukrainians were saying that this is the wake-up call that they needed, and finally starting to sort of send cultural representatives into South America, into African nations, around the world. And so the different positions that they find themselves in mean that they were just in, unfavourable. There was an unfavourable tilt towards Russia in the first place.
Andrew, one significant non-attendee is President Lula da Silva of Brazil. Now, the reason for that, and there is no reason to doubt this, is that he had a fall, bang on the head, actually quite serious, required stitches, etc. But I'm sure he has a sore head and some bruises, and it's all been no fun. But might he be somewhat grateful somewhere for the excuse not to be there?
I think there's a sense that Brazil was very excited and enthusiastic about the BRICS group, and that has gone a little bit sour. And one of the reasons it's gone a little bit sour is precisely the enlargement. Because when BRICS was, whatever it is, 5 countries, 3 of them were democracies and 2 were authoritarian regimes. since the expansion, the number of authoritarian governments is expanding quite rapidly, and Brazil feels that its, if you like, its power of influence inside the Brics is beginning to reduce, is beginning to be diluted. And I think we should also, looking forward, it's possible that Brics will have a number of internal difficulties because, after all, you've got India and China who are traditional rivals in there. You have now Iran.
I mean, India and China have, in fact, no history of agreeing on anything at all.
Yeah.
But yeah, those internal rivalries, do you think the whole thing is potentially, well, Egypt and Ethiopia as well, do you think the whole thing is perhaps a bit unwieldy?
I think it's unwieldy, and it could go, in some ways it's inspired on the non-line movement, which was, I think, at one point had 77 members. And this non-aligned movement didn't achieve very much, precisely because it was so large and there were so many positions and rivalries going on.
I mean, Julia, when you look at Brics such as it is, do you see any coherent ideological underpinning at all, or is it just the we're not quite the West club?
Yeah, I think that, I guess, from, their perspectives from their representatives, it's sort of not being talked down to by the West. There's that feeling of hypocrisy of, we should stand up against imperialism, but then they were themselves, and some of them continue to be, victims of that imperialism. But I think in response as well to what you were just saying, Andrew, too, I think that even if they are, incoherent, we ourselves, NATO and the EU and the US, we ourselves are also incoherent. And so we shouldn't ever underestimate how much damage an incoherent sort of band of friends can do to us.
But it could, I mean, there is not at all endorsing a couple of the founding states in particular, Andrew, but there is something here in that Brics, as it now is, embraces about 45% of the world's population. I mean, you're kind of cheating when you have India and China on board. 26% of the world's economy, and as Julia says, this is substantially comprised of countries that do think that they have been patronised, not listened to, ignored, exploited by the West, and some of them do assuredly have a case on that front. Is there potentially something here if we didn't have the feeling that it was, well, not kind of fundamentally hostile? I
think the battle that's going on at the moment is how to define the Brics. It
does now have a website, which is a start.
Yeah, that's true. It also has a new development bank, which plays a particularly important role in funding Chinese infrastructure and other such things. I think the battle really is about China, because there are some countries who fear, and Brazil kind of off the record may fear this, getting close to China was economically very important and very useful for Brazil, but now they're worried that BRICS will be an organization run by China, and that while on certain policies they will agree, the Brazil-China relationship is very important to the Brazilian economy, there is a fear that politically it'll be much more made in Beijing.
Julia, just finally on this one, there is a BRICS summit every year. It's not always in Russia, so it would have been easy enough for any of the countries or any of the national leaders who've gone to this to find a reason not to go. They all will have understood how the optics of them being there shaking hands with Vladimir Putin will look in the West. Is there an element there, do you think, of those countries, especially if we think of Ukraine as the locus, because it has been a thing for 2.5 years of trying to persuade the global south which side they should be on here? Are some of these leaders, do you think, sort of saying to the West, give me a reason? Are they running up the bill, basically? Yeah,
I mean, that's very much, I think, one of the reasons, yeah. And I think they're being quite cynical in the sense of playing both sides, seeing what they can get. I mean, they, at the end of the day, have to look out for themselves. What are they getting in return? What sort of security are they getting? What kind of arms are they getting? What kind of investment are they getting? You know, if China is pouring in, as we were saying, this investment into Indonesia, no Western government is sort of going in and saying, we'll build you these incredible incredible roads. So I think, what are they getting out of us?
Well, to Italy now, not the first country whose government has decided to deal with irregular migrants by sending them somewhere else, only for its courts to explain that this isn't really on. The idea was that arrivals in Italy would be dispatched to Albania, where they would be detained while their asylum claims were processed. However, Italian judges ruled that the first 16 migrants who had been sent to Albania under the scheme could not legally be detained, and as detention was a condition of their presence in Albania, Albania sent them back. Of the 16, 2 were found to be underage, 2 were ill, and all were from Bangladesh or Egypt, to which the court said it was not safe to return them. Andrew, Italy is now furiously passing a new law to try and get around the ruling, much as was attempted here by the previous government in the United Kingdom, allotting to itself the right to just decide whether a given country was safe or not. Are they not going to just keep running up against the same problem, though?
I think so. Some of them may make a legal breakthrough. I think there are three examples to talk about. Obviously, Italy and Albania.
Mm-hmm.
I think certainly the British government and Rwanda. Mm-hmm. And a third worth bearing in mind was a program introduced under Donald Trump called Remain in Mexico, which is did what it said on the tin. And they all faced major legal problems, and it almost prompts you to ask the question, did they really consult with lawyers about what was possible and what was not possible in international law or European law? I'm not sure if I've understood all the details, but it does seem that the Italian government thought it could get by European Union courts in the way it defined what is or is not a safe country, and that wasn't the case. So the law they have now passed, or the presidential decree that they have passed, will also, I think, come under scrutiny by the courts.
Julie, the other example that always comes to my mind, of course, as an Australian, is that Australia did much the same thing a long time ago, allotting migrants to Papua New Guinea and Nauru, among others, I think. And it just strikes me sometimes that what we're seeing is European leaders trying to apply an Australian solution to European geography, which I'm not convinced is necessarily going to work.
Maybe. But also, I guess, well, what strikes me about this is that it's a really sort of a solution that you can put on a headline, and that they're not really going to the root of the problem, and they're not really... I mean, look at Albanian society, for example. It has so many problems of its own. So many of their, citizens are crossing the English Channel to come here. So you've got lots of
less than they were since the UK struck an agreement with Albania to send them back.
Yes, that is true. But I guess you've got lots of people trying to leave. I was listening to a podcast last night on the BBC, and they were talking about, Albanians trying to leave there. So it's a really complicated situation, and you're sort of wading into another society, and you're trying to plonk people who don't belong there, and they're trying to get to your country, and you're sort of complicating the whole situation. So I guess what would be nice to see from politicians is a more deeply thought out strategy into thinking of why are these people trying to come to our shores? What are they fleeing from? How can we start to tackle that problem at its root?
That's all completely reasonable, Andrew, because obviously the ideal scenario is that there is no reason for people to leave in the first place. But as long as they do, and those solutions will not be arrived at anytime soon, as long as they do, if we take the bad faith out of the argument, and this argument is mostly conducted in bad faith, is it necessarily wrong for a country to say, like the United Kingdom, to say about Albania, this is not our problem, and things that are bad in Albania or are suboptimal in Albania are not our problem, or indeed for Italy to say of Bangladesh in general, that life there may be difficult or at least less pleasant than it is in Italy, but again, it's not really our responsibility?
I can see the political or even ethical argument for saying is not our responsibility. Conditions in Albania or Rwanda or wherever it may be are a separate issue. However, the problem is that it is our problem, whatever we say, as long as people are coming in large movements of migrants. Saying that it's not our problem is not going to stop people coming, because you could argue that there are other economic and demographic pressures that are causing people to move around different parts of the world. So in large parts of Europe and the US, you have an aging population, and you have a need, a labour market need, which some migrants are, whatever you may feel, rightly or wrongly, some migrants are fulfilling that need and staffing the National Health Service or the buses or whatever it is. So that, if you like, reality makes it my problem or my government's problem, and it has to have some sort of feasible policy to respond.
I mean, Julia, just finally on this, we did, of course, certainly 2.5 years ago, see a much different approach taken by most European countries when a great many people in a very big hurry left Ukraine. And by and large, the measures applied to those Ukrainian refugees were much less restrictive. And I think it's fair to say that that all caused an awful lot less trouble than trying to be restrictive does. Is there some kind of model there that could be applied more broadly?
Yeah, definitely. I think that was something that obviously I was gladdened at the time because my family members who were trying to flee were welcomed with open arms in different countries. But I guess that model really worked in terms of Ukrainians were very willing to work, and they've plugged, as we were talking about, that labour shortage that is really needed. And I guess it's that treating people with dignity and understanding their potential and what can they do for you in your country while they are here. Because as you know, Syrians and Afghanistanis were saying when they were coming here into other countries that they didn't want to be here forever. This was a temporary thing until the situation could sort of sort itself out. Obviously, that's an optimistic view of the situation, but I guess treating people with dignity and seeing their potential rather than sort of trying helplessly to get rid of this problem. And obviously, your efforts will not have success because they just won't stop trying to get here.
Well, to the UK now, and to something of a rebuke to the popular reputation of British working culture of being comprised of short bursts of actual work interrupted by longer sessions of carousing. According to research by some or other attention-seeking entity who we are rather choosing to spite by not naming, only 1 in 4 British workers will even want alcohol served at this year's Christmas party, while slightly more than half don't pitch up at after-hours events at all. Even more horrifyingly, there is a reported demand for what are referred to menacingly as games-based activities. Andrew, first of all, I incline towards scepticism vis-à-vis the headline of this report. Do we believe that 75% of British workers would rather be served mineral water upon arrival at their Christmas party?
Not necessarily. I think... there's one thing is what you feel and the other is what you say you feel when somebody with a clipboard approaches you for an instant survey. So I think...
Yeah, I do wonder how many people in that circumstance would say, no, I plan to get absolutely hammered and make a complete fool of myself.
Yes. I think things have changed, and that there is less drinking in places of work, to put it bluntly. If you look back over the last 20 or 30 years, I don't think it's the end of alcohol consumption at all. I'm also interested, the idea that you perhaps less involved in work events is interesting. The kind of obsessive, I live to work is probably something that wasn't good, and it's less present than before. But my own view is there's nothing wrong with a drink in moderation, and if you instead of saying 75% are not interested in drinking, you just drink when you want to, and that's it. So you don't have to stop other people drinking, is I suppose what I'm trying to say.
Julia, this inevitably is where you will be the scapegoat for your entire allegedly much more abstemious younger generation. Do you think this is actually true? It is a thing I keep reading, that the younger folk are much less bibulous than certain predecessor generations. I don't know whether that's true or whether it's just that at £8 a pint nobody can afford it anymore, or is there actually anything going on here?
Oh, I don't know. This is a constant question I actually ask myself, because I always look back at my parents' stories of their young when they were still starting their careers in the 90s, And I guess all the booze that was around then. And, Keir Starmer even wanted to outlaw smoking in pub gardens at one point. So I guess there is something there. We're sort of becoming puritanical and we're forgetting how to have fun. And I guess phones are a part of that. Like, you forget how to communicate with other people. I think the pandemic was really difficult for me and my friends in terms of like knowing how to communicate with other people, and it really did take time. But I think that there is a movement back towards, maybe this is the sort of peak of like not knowing kind of how to sort of let your hair down and have fun. And I think we are going to move back. Surely we're going to move back to something better.
A follow up on the phones one, though, because this is something that younger relatives of mine back in the old country put to me, that they said that part of the reason, well, as one of them put it to me, they just said, Andrew, how many photos of you in your teens and 20s are there, full stop?
Yeah.
And honestly, it's a few dozen. And they said, that's exactly it. You're photographed all the time now. And as one of my younger relatives was saying, there's that part of you thinking just one photo and I'll never be Prime Minister.
That's true. I mean, there are many photos and I'll never be Prime Minister. No, I guess there's that. You feel like you're being watched. But also there's this feeling of like being connected all the time. And that's quite tricky for being able to sort of let go, relax and socialise. I actually had my phone stolen a week ago and suddenly I was without a phone and I felt so much more free and so much lighter, and I could suddenly make these spontaneous plans because my calendar had been wiped and I had absolutely no idea who I was seeing and what I was doing. So I wrote down, everyone's phone numbers on my piece of paper and I'd be calling them up from other people's phones saying, oh, do you want to grab a drink in like half an hour? And life became a lot more spontaneous. So I think this calendar, the tyranny of the calendar, I think that's a big thing for sure.
And Andrew, just a final thought though. Do you think that fundamentally socialising among colleagues is good for a business? Because I think it's fair to say that here at Monocle there is a view that it definitely is. And I think we do a decent drink up every so often.
I do think socialising is important, but it can be pushed too far. I do remember, I will mention the name of the organisation. I used to work in the BBC, and we were doing some sort of, team building exercise. And somebody I knew just said, I can't.
Was it a games-based activity?
It was games-based activity, no. And he expressed absolute hatred for games-based activities and facilitators and the whole thing. He just liked to sort of keep himself to himself, which I thought was a legitimate position.
Yeah, we've never had, that I know of, a games-based activity here. It sounds ghastly.
That's probably a good thing.
I think so entirely. Andrew Thompson and Julia Lasica, thank you both for joining us. Finally, on today's show, it is conventional wisdom that the Pacific Ocean will be the crucial geostrategic arena of our time. It is a reasonable assertion, given that the thing is bordered on one side by the United States, on the other by China, with a bunch of other countries both geographically and strategically between. But the Pacific is not the only contested ocean. As a new book by our next guest demonstrates, the Indian Ocean is at least as important and at least as contentious. The guest is Darshana M. Barua. The book is The Contest for the Indian Ocean and the Making of a New World Order, and I spoke to Darshana earlier. I began by asking if the Indian Ocean is starting to ascend towards the Pacific in everyone's list of priorities.
I still don't think Indian Ocean is getting enough of attention. I think Pacific still gets more attention, and it is not to take away from the geographical and the strategic importance of the Pacific, but there is perhaps more realization and an effort to understand the importance of the Indian Ocean, but it depends on which part of the capital you're in. The decision to write this book was very much influenced by my conversation across different capitals and the understanding of the Indian Ocean, or the lack thereof, I would say, about the Indian Ocean region. For instance, a lot of the countries still don't have Indian Ocean strategy, but they have a Pacific strategy. And this is a question I often ask to European navies. When you go to the Pacific, you have to transit the Indian Ocean. So how are you having a strategy about the Pacific without first having a strategy about the Indian Ocean? And I believe to a large degree it's because how Washington frames its security threats among its allies and why it catches up more in the policy conversations.
So in the Indian Ocean, as distinct from the Pacific, what are the potential threats as you see them? What kind of things should people have a policy about?
I think the first one is to really just look at the Indian Ocean as, for instance, after the Cold War, the Indian Ocean got divided into continental subdivisions of Africa, Middle East, and South Asia. So the ocean disappeared. Whereas before that, in Great Power Competition, you looked at it as one transit area, you looked at it through choke points, Red Sea, and Straits of Malacca. So you could have an understanding of where threats are coming up, what was happening. But because of the what I in the book call continentalization of a maritime domain, you ended up dividing into issues of Africa, Middle East, and South Asia. Now, when you think about South Asia and challenges, government bureaucracies are going to tell you about Afghanistan and Pakistan and India and Bangladesh. And if you say Middle East, it's going to be all continental challenges, and Africa is all continental challenges. But when you look at Indian Ocean, that's when you start seeing why would something like Houthi attacks happen? What is the role of fishing vessels? When did the Chinese start deploying submarines into the Indian Ocean region? What is that connection to Pacific? How is that connected to the Pacific? What is the energy transit in the Indian Ocean region? And how does the Indian Ocean having an impact in foreign policy choices of governments who want to have a better Indo-Pacific policy? But it's very difficult to do that unless you look at the Indian Ocean in its geographical reality as an ocean and not divided into Africa, Middle East, and South Asia.
I mean, are you concerned that it's a realm where, not for the first time, the Western world might find itself trying to catch up with China in a particular realm? You describe the Indian Ocean as China would see it as a sea of vulnerabilities, which I imagine Beijing is quite keen to do something about.
Yes, absolutely. I do. I think we are playing catch up to China in the Indian Ocean region. And I do acknowledge that policies coming up as a result of only a threat sometimes is hurried and rushed, but in the strategic probably realities that you should be looking at it. But to address that, China, absolutely. The only overseas base China has in the entire world is in the Indian Ocean region. It's in Djibouti. But when Djibouti came up, we all classified it as an Africa development. And then you think, okay, Africa is too far away. Like, all right, they're doing more in Africa. What are they doing in Indian Ocean? Nothing. Okay. And their increments of sort of engagements in the Indian Ocean has been pretty rapid and I would say pretty significant. In 2014, they sent their first submarines into the Indian Ocean region. 2008, they set up their anti-piracy task force in Gulf of Aden. 2014, they sent their first submarines into the Indian Ocean region. 2017, they set up a base in the Indian Ocean region. So, you are seeing in terms of the next I see is an aircraft carrier. They're the only country with an embassy in each of the 6 islands across the Indian Ocean region. No other country, has that or has that diplomatic footprint. Economic engagements across Africa, across Middle East, across South Asia. And in Chinese literature, in Chinese thinking of being a maritime, their thinking to be a global power is associated to being a maritime power. And to be a maritime power, they need to first secure their sea lines of communications, but also provide or establish themselves as a credible security and strategic and economic partner to a lot of their friends and allies. And they can't do that unless they are in the Indian Ocean region. So I think Indian Ocean is very, very critical for them. I define the Indo-Pacific as Pacific is the defensive theater. The biggest threat, the United States, is sitting across on the other side of the Pacific. They will always have to be conscious about the Pacific. That's where the threats come from. Their growth story is in the Indian Ocean. They can't grow economically, politically, strategically, engagement with Global South, resources, market, industry, all of that, Africa, Middle East, Europe, South Asia, that's through the Indian Ocean side.
I just wanted to ask finally about the role that is being played or might be played by African countries. And you're quite right, Africa is usually thought of as a continental realm, i.e. Africa, rather than a shore of the Indian Ocean. Do you see any indication of African countries becoming significant players in the Indian Ocean, or are they just all being recruited as other people's allies?
No, I think Africa is going to play a massive and significant role in it. Africa, we hear there's much more conversation in the ASEAN way and sort of, the Southeast Asian countries where you hear countries saying, don't make us pick and don't make us choose. I think Africa is always African countries. Seychelles is the country with a national security sort of document on blue economy. African nations on the eastern coast of Africa, part of IORA, Indian Ocean Commission, Arab League, of course, African Union. What happens in South Africa? What happens in Seychelles and Mauritius? What happens happens in Kenya and Mozambique, whether from the economic point of view, whether from the digital point of view. I think there's that agency that we forget to talk about, that Africa's agency of choices, the foreign policy choices and the economic choices will have a great impact on how we start to see great power competition in the Indian Ocean region. The part that is risky, and this is something I talk about in the book, is that we are too used to studying great power competition from the lens of the bigger powers with the bigger militaries and bigger economies, because that's how historically we have looked at great power competition. But I think in today's world, small island states as well, who might not match up to anything in terms of economic or military strength, can have an impact on the geopolitical realities around the ocean or around the region, based on the partners that they choose, based on the priorities that they define for themselves, and based on the economic roadmap and foreign policy roadmaps that they articulate for themselves. So I think we also have to rethink how we study great power competition and the strategies that are based around it.
That was Darshana M. Barua, author of The Contest for the Indian Ocean and the Making of a New World Order, available now. And that is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to our panellists today, Andrew Thompson and Julia Lasica. Today's show was produced by Hassan Anderson and researched by Sana Jumani. Our sound engineer was Sarah Nichol. I'm Andrew Mueller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time tomorrow. Thanks for listening.